what it looks like to truly be called. What it looks like to truly be called. And so there is something missing in here, and that's Moses' viewpoint. And Moses' viewpoint tells us, man, see, because this story that we're reading here tells us what's happening to Moses. It doesn't tell us what's happening inside of Moses. It doesn't tell us what's happening inside of Moses. And so if you want to understand what's happening inside of Moses, we have to turn to Acts 6:10 and Acts 7:23. And I'm just going to go through here real quickly. But Acts 6:10, this is important because it says, this is Stephen talking, and he says, and they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit in which he spoke. So I just want you to realize that as Stephen was speaking, he was not speaking through his own understanding. He was not speaking through having read the word or studied the word himself. He was speaking by the inspired word of the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit was using Stephen to share something that the Israelites had not heard before. Now, if you go down, you'll hear what the Holy Spirit was inspiring him to say and share. And that's in Acts 7:23-25. And this is what Stephen is beginning to speak. And this is the inspired word from God that Stephen is speaking. So when you read this, you know based off of the other verse that this is God speaking, although Stephen is the one actually giving the words to it. And Stephen is speaking about Moses right here, and it says, and now it came when he was 40 years old, when Moses was 40 years old, it came into his house to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged he who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian. So far, he's just repeating the story that we've read in Exodus. But here's where it gets different. Verse 25 says, for he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would have delivered them by his hand, but they did not understand. It is in verse 25 that the Holy Spirit decides to open our understanding, decides to show us what is going on in Moses' mind, what's happening inside of Moses at that very moment where everything goes down. And when it talks about them, it says, it explains it, and the Holy Spirit is saying that Moses supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver him from his hands. This means that before anything else, before the burning bush, before the miracles, before anything that Moses had done, before he took the staff and turned it into a serpent, before God had him part the Red Sea, before anything else, this means before the burning bush and before this very moment to where he attacked the Egyptian, and before any of this means that Moses knew what he was called to do. This is what the Holy Spirit is trying to say when it says, this is what, for he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them from his hand, which means Moses understood that God had planned Moses and had set Moses up, and that Moses understood that he had a destiny, he had a purpose, he had a calling, he had an anointing, he had an assignment over his life to deliver the Israelites from the Egyptians. But this means that Moses understood this before the burning bush. Whenever we watch the burning bush, we think that that's where God is speaking to Moses and releasing, hey Moses, I'm going to send you over here to Egypt. But Moses already knew this. Moses already knew it before God spoke. Before this powerful moment that we watched in the video, before God verbally spoke to Moses, and before Moses did any miracles, he understood that he was called to a great destiny, and he understood part of his destiny and understood that he was called to deliver the Israelites. This is an incredible thing to realize that Moses understood this beforehand. Because see, we always look on the outside for proof. We always look, no, you have to realize, this means that Moses understood something about his destiny that God did not tell him yet. because God hasn't come with the bush yet. This means that Moses understood something about his destiny that the Egyptians didn't tell him. This means that Moses understood something about his destiny that he had to have understood it inside of himself. Because nobody outside is telling Moses about his destiny. Nobody here has told Moses anything that he would be a leader of the Israelites. But he understands it, but nobody told him. Now this is important because we always look outside for the proof or the evidence of what we're created to do. We are always looking outside for the evidence. Well, what did this person say? Well, 3 people over here told me that I might be able to do this. We are looking for someone else to tell us this is what you're called to do. You can do this. You are assigned to this. You can do this. And we are always looking for someone as some type of sign outside of ourselves. Out here, God verbally speaking to us. The prophets coming to us. The pastor sharing with us and saying, you can do this. This is possible. We are looking for our parents to confirm this. We are looking for our friends to agree with this. We are looking for something outside to tell us and to share with us as evidence or proof that we are supposed to do something. That we are supposed to do something and be something. That we are supposed to do something that we're created to do. And so because of that, Christians everywhere sit back waiting for this outside sign. They're waiting for the proof to come from the outside in to tell them, hey, you can do this. You're called to do this. Or this is what your destiny is. Or this is what your purpose is. And because they're waiting from the outside in, can you imagine if Moses waited for an outside sign? Man. You have to realize nobody told Moses. No one told Moses that he was going to be a leader of the Israelites and take them out and deliver them. I'm not saying Moses didn't know. He did know. He just did not know it by anybody else telling him. Here's the proof that nobody told him. The Egyptians didn't tell him. The Egyptians would have killed him if they knew it. If the Egyptians knew what Moses knew about himself, Pharaoh would have killed him long before this point. So you knew the Egyptians didn't tell him. You know his brethren didn't tell him, because right here it says, for he supposed his brethren would have understood. But the brethren didn't understand. So you knew his family, his brethren, his own people, his own kin, the people you would think might be able to see and understand, hey, God called you to do this. You would think that they would be able to see it, but they didn't. And so if they didn't see it, it would have been impossible for them to tell Moses. So it wasn't from them. And so can you see Moses? Can you see Moses? Here he is living in this place, and his very own brethren don't know this call. His very own, his family, his flesh and blood, his mother and his father, the people that he's in, his adopted parents, his school teachers, his everybody around him, and nobody understands that there's something that he knows about himself, and no one else can know it. This is why you'll see people that as they grow up, they'll begin to realize that they're different from the people around them. They'll begin to realize that there's something a little bit different about them and their parents, or them and their children, or their siblings, or them they're friends with, or everything else, and they won't know how to put it in words, or they won't know how to do it. Oh man, because sometimes nobody else knows it. And then the last thing is that we know God didn't tell him, not from a verbal voice, anyways, because God was going to come down and tell him in 40 years. So in 80 years of Moses' life, God never verbally came in and said, Moses, this is what you're going to do. So if it's not God, it's not your family, and it's not the Egyptians, your people, the culture, everything else, we have eliminated all other voices that could have spoken to this person and tell him. But I believe that sometimes our modern Christianity looks for those 3 different things to conform to us. We begin to look for the proof that we really are called, that we are this, and we begin to look in those 3 different areas, in what our family says about us, in what God says about us verbally, and what our culture says about us. Even if you go into the world's culture is constantly telling you something about yourself. But even if you leave the world's culture and go into Christian culture, you are still encountering something to where you're trying to understand who you are based off of the culture. And the culture will begin to tell you certain things. And if you don't believe me, let me give you an example of certain people that they believe, hey, if I have a call, I'm expecting, prophets to come and speak to me. And if no prophets come and speak to me, then I guess I don't have a call. You are still expecting the Christian culture to communicate to you about this. But Moses didn't have any of these things to communicate to him. None of these things were communicated to Moses. Because sometimes sometimes something happens to where a still small voice begins to move inside of you. And it's so small and so still that you're not even sure if you heard it right. And you just sit on it and you just think about it and you just anticipate it and you just review it. And then the still small voice whispers again. And sometimes it happens when you're so young, you don't even know you're hearing this still small voice. And you just grow up. And as you grow up, you just know that you are called to do this. You just know that you will be the one to do this. You just know that you can do this. But sometimes the still small voice doesn't come as a little child. Sometimes it comes as you get older and as you move forward. But it's a still small voice, because sometimes it's not the burning bush that God is speaking to us through. Sometimes it's not the voice that echoes into the cave and that makes goosebumps come upon you. It is the still small voice. A still small voice. So small it's like a whisper in you. So small it's in a whisper. Have anybody had a whisper where God has whispered to you about something about who you are and about your destiny? You may not even know it was God whispering to you. You just believe something about yourself. And at this point, you might not even believe it anymore, but you believed it once. You heard it once. Because it's so small that you don't even notice that it's a thought. See, we have looked for burning bushes to tell us that we have a great destiny. But Moses is lucky in his case almost, because he had no Christian culture that told him, look for the burning bush. And because he didn't look for the burning bush, when he heard the still small voice, he began to believe it or recognize what was happening. And it began to stir up inside of him. Because sometimes we look for, we are attempting, we're believing that if we have a destiny, or if we have an assignment, or if God will do miracles through us, He will tell us through a burning bush. He will tell us through something huge. But that is culture talking. That is culture talking to you. It might be Christian culture, but it's still culture talking to you. It's tradition. It's our understanding. It's our looking at these things and anticipating it and not seeing the underlying situation. And so all the while we're waiting for this burning bush, we're sitting here waiting and going, assuming that it's going to come sometime in our life, growing old, and all the while God has been whispering to us. A still small voice. Little bit by little bit. And so Moses begins to hear this, he begins to hear this still small voice, and he begins to realize something is different about him, and he begins coming to an understanding of himself, not while he is in front of a burning bush, but while he's at school. While he is waking up in the morning. While he is doing his chores. And while he's growing up, somewhere along the way, a still small voice begins to communicate to Moses. And he heard it little bit by little bit. And little bit by little bit, something began to build inside of him and begin to transition. And something began to form inside of him to where his mind was beginning to shape. And he began to understand something about his call. And he began to understand something that God was going to do. And he began to understand something, so that when he saw the situation, he thought that everybody else would understand, but you have to realize he understood it so much, he was willing to kill for it. He was willing to kill because he believed it. The still small voice. The still small voice. Samuel 3, 1 through 5 talks about the still small voice in such a unique perspective if you're tuned to it. Thanks. 1 Samuel 3, 1 through 5. I think you had it. If you can go back. Go back. You went too far. Nope. Go one down. There we go. Now the boy Samuel ministered to the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no widespread revelation. And it came to pass at that time while Eli was laying down in his place, when his eyes had begun to grow dim so that he could not see. Now this is very important. People miss this, but Eli, his eyes are going dim. Now, have you guys ever heard, of the story of, I'm trying to think, there's a theory that says if one of your senses gets decreased, your other sense gets better. Yes. So if you can't see, your ears get better. Yes. So Eli's eyes couldn't see, so he couldn't see anything, but his ears were sharp. So his ears were so sharp he could hear things, and he could hear what was going on in the other room, and he could hear what was going on over here, and he had sharp ears. It's kind of like that time when you're with your mother or something as a child, and you say something like, I don't want to, and you back talk or whatever, and somehow she hears you and she calls you out, and you're like, how did you hear that? It's not exactly like that, but it's close, okay? Eli's eyes were dim. He couldn't see, but he could hear, and he could hear well, and he could hear articulately. Eli's job was to hear God. He could hear so well. But it says, and it came to pass while Eli was laying down in his place, when his eyes had begun to grow so dim that he could not see, and before the lamp of God went out in the tabernacle of the Lord where the ark was. And while Samuel was laying down, here Samuel is a little boy. Probably Hadessa's age, I'm imagining. A little boy. While Samuel was laying down, that the Lord called Samuel, and he said, here I am. And he ran to Eli and said, here I am, for you called me. Go down. Do you have the next? I don't know if I gave you the next one or not. He goes down. Nope. Okay. He goes down and he says, here I am, for you called me. But Eli goes back and says, I didn't call you. Go back. And God calls him again. But you have to realize, God was whispering to Samuel. It was such a still, small voice that Eli, whose ears had become sharpened and strengthened, and his ears had become his dominant senses. And Eli was sleeping, and Samuel was in the other room, and God is speaking and saying, Samuel. And Eli doesn't hear anything because it's a small, still voice. It's a small, still voice. Elijah has the same situation happening when he goes into the cave and when he goes to speak to God, and in the cave God comes, and he comes in a storm, and the wind comes and it knocks down and it breaks things, but God was not in the wind. And then comes a fire, and fire comes down consuming everything, and God was not in the fire. And then comes an earthquake, and God was not in the earthquake, and it shakes everything. These are noises loud, but God was not in any of them. And then comes a small whisper where God begins to say, Elijah, Elijah. And Elijah walks out because he has learned that sometimes God speaks in a still, small voice. Don't tell me that God only speaks in burning bushes. Because God speaks in both. And so God has been speaking to us all along. Just like Moses, as he walked and as he moved, God has been speaking to people in this room all along in a still, small voice, telling us about our destiny, telling us about things, and sharing something he wants us to understand. But let's get back to Moses for a second, because this is where it gets interesting. Here Moses is, and he heard the still small voice. He may not have known it was God speaking, but he still heard it. And he received it, and it began to influence his mind, and it began to influence his thought pattern, and it began to influence how he looked at things, until it came to the point to where Moses understood it so much. He knew something and understood something about himself and his call and his destiny so much that when he saw an Egyptian coming and beating up a Hebrew, he came and he took a sword and he killed a man. Not because he was angry, but because he understood, wait, I'm called to take the Israelites out. This is my purpose. This is why I'm here. This is who I am. He knew it so much, he was willing to end somebody's life for him. All over a still small voice. Despite himself here, oh man, he knew something so much. But despite himself knowing it, man, it's important you realize how well Moses understood this, and be able to see that Moses' actions communicate the level that he understood about himself. He said, I'm willing to take a chance and to become an outlaw, a murderer. I'm willing to have people almost come after me. I'm willing to do it because I understand something about myself to such an extent. And so Moses understands something, he hears something, and he understands something to such an extent. But this is where it gets difficult. Because the difficulty of the small voice is, because despite the small voice being revealed, despite Moses' destiny being revealed by the still small voice of God, sometimes life makes you doubt that you ever heard anything. Sometimes life sets something up so that you end up doubting that you ever heard that still small voice. Sometimes life comes into a situation to where you end up doubting ever having heard this still small voice, and you end up believing that no, what culture said about me is true. What my family said about me is more true than what the still small voice said. You end up believing all these other things. Man, because watch this situation unfold from Moses' perspective. This is where it gets difficult. The still small voice. Exodus 3:11. Go down one slide. I think you have it. Exodus 3:11. For Moses said to God, oh wait. Nope. I gave you the wrong verse. That wasn't you. Let me see. It's going to actually be Exodus 2. Bear with me as I pull it up. Exodus 2:11. I apologize. Exodus 2:11, it says, For now it came to pass in those days, when Moses had grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren, and he looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptians and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting, and they said to the one who did the wrong, Why are you striking your companion? And he said, Who made you prince or judge over us? Who do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So Moses feared, and he said, Surely this thing is known. And when Pharaoh heard this matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled. Watch the situation from Moses' perspective. Moses knew something about himself. He heard something about himself, and he moved on what he knew. He moved on his purpose, and he went out on a limb to save the person, his brethren, the person that he thought that he had been called to deliver. And he went out on a limb, and he saved him. And he took the brunt of it. He took the danger. He approached this, and he handled it. But as he did this, instead of his brethren recognizing and saying, wow, you would do that for us? Man, maybe there is something here. Instead of his brethren recognizing that he had been called to deliver them, instead of his brethren understanding this or anything about that, instead his brethren come back and they mock him and they reject him. And then they tell Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh comes to kill him. And so his own brethren give him up. Wait. Isn't this to the very people that Moses is willing to put his life on the line for and to risk for? They are the ones that are rejecting him. They are the ones that are putting him out there and persecuting him and sending and causing him to have to flee. Because of that situation, he had to flee for his life. He had to leave all his privileges, his home, his family. He had to leave his mother and father. He had to leave everything that he knew. Everything that he knew, he had to leave for. All this is happening because he thought he heard the still small voice. He thought he heard the still small voice, and he moved in the still small voice. And now all this is happening. And now he's in a foreign land while his parents grow old. It says he was there at 80 years old, so it's assumed that before he came back to Egypt, his parents died. So he never gets to see them again. He never gets to see his adopted people again. He never gets to see any of these things again. He is in this foreign country for 40 years. All because of this. Now he's a murderer instead of a leader. Now he's an exile instead of a hero. Now he is banished and hunted down and having people that would kill him instead of being celebrated and recognized that there was a purpose and a destiny on his life. Now he's abandoned, he's forsaken, he's persecuted, and he's alone, and he's by himself. All because of a still small voice. And all because, all this is happening. And Moses looks at it now. Because there are three things that make it difficult when it comes to these, that life brings up when it's difficult when it comes to this still small voice. There are three problems with hearing a still small voice that becomes hard. And the first of the problem is that nobody else hears it. Nobody else heard the still small voice that Moses heard. Nobody else heard what Moses heard. When Samuel heard God, Eli didn't hear him. Nobody else heard the whispers that God was telling him. God was whispering in his ears, Moses, you see the Egyptians? You see the Israelites? I'm going to cause you to heal them. I'm going to cause you to take them out. I'm taking you away. That's why I saved you here. That's why I protected you. Do you know that you're going to love them and protect them and fight over them, and you're going to pray for them, and you're going to lead them out, and you're going to rescue them? Do you know you're going to take them over here, and you're going to do this? Moses, do you know all this? Moses, do you see this? But nobody else heard what God was whispering to Moses. Moses was the only person that heard it. And so when Moses moved on it, and when he talked about it, he expected everybody else to know, isn't this obvious? Can't you see what I see? Can't you hear what I heard? Can't you understand what I understood? But nobody else did. And when nobody else hears it, no one else will believe it. And so while Moses heard, the others were like, look, we don't know what God told you. He didn't tell us. So he may have told you, but he sure didn't tell us, so we don't believe it. You go your way. We're not, oh my gosh. Man, I just remembered, I remember the time to where I was trying to share with my brothers something, and my oldest brother came back and he said, "Well, God didn't tell me that you'd do that to me." The problem with the still small voice is you hear it, but nobody else, other people hear it. No one else can hear it, and when they don't hear it, they don't believe it. If they did not hear from God, then they're not going to believe it. And so now I would like to tell you, oh, there's a solution. This is how you deal with that. You get away with it. But there is no solution to that. This is the reality of it. If God has whispered something inside of you, get used to it. There won't be somebody else. Everybody else will not have heard the very thing that God spoke to you. He spoke to you. That's why he's whispering. If he was speaking out by a verbal mouth, when God spoke to Jesus after Jesus went down and got baptized, God spoke in a voice and he said, "This is my son who I am well pleased with, and I am well pleased with," because he wanted everybody to hear it. But when he speaks to a whisper to you, and it's only you, then don't expect all your brethren and all the people around you and everybody else to understand it or believe it. Because they're thinking, because they're thinking, I should believe what you heard more than what I have heard, and they won't do it. Acts 9:7, you have that back there. I want to show you this because, Acts 9:7. This is when God spoke to Saul on the road to Damascus, and he spoke to Saul, and it said, and when he spoke, the voice Saul heard what he heard. It says the men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They had heard the sound, but they didn't see anybody. They didn't hear the words. Because what God spoke was spoken to them. Now the funny thing is we see Saul changing his way, but we don't hear anything about these men ever again. Because they did not hear what God said. They did not hear what God said to Saul. And so I'm sure Saul shared it with them. And yet they decided to believe what they heard, which was a noise, a sound. We heard something, but we didn't hear what it actually was. We didn't hear the specifics, so we're going to go our way and believe what we believe, and we're going to go in our direction. You go your way, Saul. Let's part ways here. You heard something that we didn't hear. And that's the first difficulty, because nobody else hears it. The second difficulty is, and we touched on this, is because they cannot hear it, the people will tend to reject it. And now you have to deal, on top of the fact that you're the only one that hears it, you have to deal with the rejection that comes, the hurt that comes. When Moses believed that he was helping the people, and they turned around and they gave him up to be killed. The very people that Moses is trusting and stepping out a limb to help, and believing and knowing his destiny is tied to them and saying, "Hey, come here, I'm going to help you, I'm going to stand here." And yet the very moment he does that, they give him up to be killed, and now he has to deal with this. For 40 years he runs. 40 years he gives up seeing his family. He gives up seeing his people, all because they rejected him. All because they couldn't hear it, and they rejected him. And now he has to deal with the hurt. The hurt of 40 years of thinking about this. And thinking of why could you not understand that? And realizing that if they had just trusted him, or known, or seen, or anything, all this wouldn't have happened. But when they don't see it, they tend to reject it. The third difficulty, and sometimes the most tough thing in it all, the third difficulty with the still small voice, is because while you hear it in your ear, you don't yet see it. And so you hear what God is saying, and God is speaking to you about this purpose and about this destiny and about this thing that is absolutely incredible. And you know it and you hear it and you know other people haven't heard it and you've gotten okay with it. You said, okay, I can walk this by myself. I can walk this line on my own. And then you've dealt with the rejection and you've dealt with the hurt that comes by their actions. And you said, Lord, all I did was follow what you shared with me, but I'm still hurt and I'm still alone and I'm still over this situation. But you've dealt with that and you've gotten that. But now you're sitting here excited and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, because the truth is even though he's told you something, you still can't see it. And Moses waited for 40 more years. Moses was 80 years old before he saw it. Which meant that if God began to speak to Moses about this at, let's say, around 20, let's just say halfway through there, that meant that he had 60 years that God had spoken to him about something and he did not see it. 60 years of a whisper that told him. And he's like, when will it come to pass? When will I see it? Instead of me being with the people even, instead of me being around them, instead of me being even respected, everything is stacked against me. Everything is stacked against me, God, Moses is thinking. He's like, he is in a foreign land, hunted by the government, labeled a criminal, pushed out by his own people, don't respect him, think he's an outsider because of his past, and he's way out here for 40 years, which is the third difficulty of hearing a still small voice, because sometimes God gives us sneak peeks or teaches us or shows us something long before it ever happens. And so 40 years this all happens, and Moses looks at it. Moses has been whispered about being a leader, but he sees no one following him. Moses has been whispered about delivering his people, but he tried to deliver them, and instead they rejected him, and he couldn't even deliver a single person. Moses has whispered about creating miracles and wonders, and instead is a murderer. And he's saying, Lord, you're telling me something. I'm hearing a whisper, but I'm not seeing anything. I'm not seeing anything at all. Because he couldn't even deliver a single one of his brethren. Not a single person could he deliver. He tried to, but the very first time he tried to do it, it backfired. And so for 40 years, Moses is sitting in the desert thinking about these three things. No one else believed in him. No one else believed it. No one else could hear it. So nobody else believed it. So they rejected it. And ultimately that rejection led to him getting hurt and his life falling apart. And then that he is hearing something that he's not been able to see. For 40 years, Moses begins to think about this and think about it. And as he thinks about it, something begins to happen. As he thinks about this. Now, before I go forward, I want you to realize that he is thinking about this in the desert. And the proof of this is you saw it in the clip. But the clip puts it in a different perspective. But when God speaks to Moses, Moses has answers already ready. God says, I'm going to do this. And Moses says, well, you can't. I'm the wrong person. A, B, and C. Wait. God is coming to you and talking to you, and you already have an answer ready? Maybe Moses has premeditated the answer. Maybe Moses has thought about this so much that the moment that God comes onto the scene, he already knows, look, God, I've thought about this before. Thought about this for 40 long years. Let me tell you why it's not going to happen. Let me tell you why I was wrong. Now, no, man. Because in the 40 years, when you encounter these three things, something happens and a question begins to form in your mind. A question begins to slip inside of you. And this is the question. And I believe this is what Moses struggled with or had to deal with in those 40 years. And this is the question. Is it enough? Is a still small voice enough? Is what I heard as a child enough proof that you'll do it? is what I heard in the still small voice. This quiet moment of night. Is it enough to base my life on? Is it enough that I go out on a limb and do this? God, was I wrong in trusting the still small voice? Was I wrong in believing in the still small voice enough to go and help this Israelite? Can you imagine this question that is going through in Moses' head? Is it enough? Is the still small voice is what I heard when you whispered to me and you told me this, and you didn't come with a burning fire. You didn't come verbally. You have not spoken to me from a burning bush. You've only come in a still small voice. Is that still small voice enough proof and evidence that I heard you right and that you will do what you would do and that I am the man that you've called for this job, or the woman that you've called for this job? And this is the question that we have to deal with. This is the question that weighs on us when we hear the still small voice, but when life throws those three things and we realize we're the only one that heard it. And eventually we come back to this question and we ask, is this enough? Have what I heard in secret enough to build my life on? Is it enough proof? Is it enough to step out on faith? Is it enough proof that God would do it? Is it enough proof that God really picked Moses to be the deliverer of his people? And this is the question that Moses thought about for 40 years. Is the fact that I have heard in a whisper, that I've heard something in a whisper, enough evidence that it will happen or that I'm the one? When God has not yet shown up in the burning bush, when nobody else can hear what we have heard, and when you do not know when or how it will happen, is it enough? And so for 40 years, Moses walks through the wilderness. And I think for 40 years, he struggles with that. And he pushes back and forth. And he thinks about it. And he looks at it. And he evaluates himself and says, wait, did I hear wrong? Maybe that wasn't enough proof. Maybe I messed it up. Maybe I didn't do right. Maybe God never even whispered and I just heard it all wrong. And he wonders if he had did it differently, would he still be in the Pharaoh's house? Would he still be a prince of Egypt? Would he still be around his brethren? Would he have gotten to see his parents die? Would he have gotten to say goodbye? Would he have had this stuff? And he wonders and he says, man, did I think about this wrong? Did I evaluate this still small voice incorrectly? And he struggled with it back and forth and back and forth until 40 years later, God sends a sheep over here into a cave. And when the sheep walks into this cave, God has a bush burning, but the bush doesn't burn. It just stays there. And Moses walks it and sees it and says, I'm going to see this great and wondrous thing. What is this? I've never seen anything like this. And when he comes into the presence of it, God begins to speak to him. This time, he speaks to him verbally. And he says, Moses, Moses, the ground that you're on is holy ground. And he begins to speak to Moses. But he is not speaking to Moses as if he is sharing with Moses for the first time in Moses' life what his call is. He is not telling Moses, I know you're way out here in the wilderness, and I don't think you know this, but actually, I'm going to send you to the Egyptians. That's not what he's saying. He is coming to finally confirm to Moses that it was right, that what he heard all along was right. And so he begins to take Moses and he repeats again to Moses, this time in an audible voice, what he had told Moses as a whisper and said, Moses, remember that whisper I told you? Remember that still small voice that you heard? Well, listen to me right now, because right now I have something to say to you. And this is what I have to say to you. The things that I told you as a still small voice, they will write, and I want you to go. And I am sending you to the Egyptians. I am sending you to the Israelites. I am sending you to fulfill your purpose. God, can you see this? The burning bush was not the confirmation that he was called. The burning bush was God confirming that yes, the whisper is enough. That yes, the still small voice was enough. Moses heard God. That yes, when he speaks to you, his voice alone is proof enough to dedicate your life on it, to step out on a limb, to become persecuted if need be, to become attacked if need be, but to step out on faith on what he has whispered inside of you. Oh. There are three reasons that it's enough. There are three things that I want to share with you that it's enough, and then I'm going to pray us out and end it. There are three reasons that a still small voice is enough. The very first one is found in Hebrews 11:1. Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." What God is talking about is that faith, if you have it and the still small voice comes to build your faith, to share your faith in things, that this is it. But God is saying that the still small voice, he is saying that faith alone is proof of things unseen. So stop expecting to see it. God's saying you may not see it. You may not see it how it's done, when it's done, where it's at, or it may be years until you actually see the fulfillment of that small still voice. But if there's evidence, and that is the evidence that proves that the still small voice is enough. The second verse, the second proof, is John 20:29. John 20:29. It says, "And Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen, yet have believed." Now, if you look at this in regards to the still small voice that God has spoken to you, God is saying, blessed are you. If you believe what God has spoken to you, the whisper he's told you, the things that he's told you, without seeing yet. Without seeing with your eyes, without seeing it happen, Moses, without seeing it come, believe without seeing it come. Without seeing your brethren recognize and hear it too, without anybody coming back and saying, oh, you know what, God spoke to me the very same thing. By the way, it's over here, you know. Because blessed are those who have not seen, yet have believed. And the very last verse that I want to share with proof to you that the still small voice is enough. If God is speaking to you and whispering to you, to be able to listen to that and seek that and hear that. The very last verse is Proverbs 23:7. And I'm just going to borrow a part of it where it says, "For he thinks in his heart, so is he." So if he thinks in his heart, so is he. This is why God speaks to you in a small whisper, and he speaks to you directly to the heart, because he wants you to begin to think something in your heart about yourself. Because he knows that, hey, do you not realize that if you have it in your heart, what's come into your heart is what you. Now, we understand that. We understand that on a lower scale. We can accept that when it comes to attitude or when it comes to, happiness or, everything on the lower scale. But when it comes to destiny or purpose or anointing or calling, those things are different. We're like, wait, you're saying that if I think inside my heart that I am this, that God has called me to do this, then that will actually, then so I am? But this is why God whispered to Moses' heart. Because God wanted Moses to be something. And so he didn't send somebody outside of him. He spoke to him from the inside. This whole message, this whole story about Moses, up to the burning bush, to this point, is all about proving that the small whisper is enough. to hear it and to listen to God and to set yourself out. And if you haven't heard the small whisper of God, there is nothing like it. Taking the time alone in the quiet places, because you can't hear a small whisper if you've got other stuff going on. You can't hear a small whisper if you're thinking about this and you're dealing with that and you've got people talking over here, or you've only got 5 minutes to sit down here. The only time you can hear a small whisper is when you get away from it all and you shut yourself in a door. And in the quietness and in the calmness and in the peace with it, you just begin to listen as God begins to whisper and say, hey,